All right, we are back with Root Source with Lesley Ann Richardson, and your book is called?
It is called Bible Gems from Jerusalem, and it's subtitled History and Theology in the Feasts of Israel.
Very nice.
And I include Israel, the church, as part of Israel.
Very
in that
nice.
sense.
Very nice. Tell us about the process.
Okay, so the book follows the feasts of Israel and the church over the course of a year. So I attempted to write them over a course of a year, but the editing, the actual publishing, of course, that process takes, as you know, quite a bit longer. So.
How many feast cycles have you been through in Jerusalem now?
Oh, goodness. Well, I was here in the 80s till the mid-90s, and then I came back in 2008, and Dave and I have been based here since then.
So more than 10, maybe more than 20?
15 years or so altogether.
So you've had 15 cycles to walk through the feast here.
Very privileged.
And you go through one and you pick something up that's near and dear to your heart,
exactly.
right? And you hold it, and then you go through another, and this is the collection of all your favorite points?
I did try and focus on things that were especially meaningful to me, that I felt would strike a chord with those reading the book.
Yes.
And I did try to draw in, wherever I could, points of view from the rabbis that could enrich Christian readers. And I also tried to, many times, draw on some of the older teachings of the church, because I feel that many times we tend to forget those teachings, that we've been 2,000 years of teaching that we can draw from and be enriched by. Yes.
Well, I'd like to share the story of how I got to know she was writing this book. Gidon had taken me over to meet Dave and Lesley, and I think Lesley had just finished reading the Blood Moons book, the book Israel First that Gidon and I did. And you made some comments and you said, I have a write-up that I think might be interesting for you. It's a write-up on Passover. Of course, the Blood Moons were on Passover and Sukkot. And what was so touching to me was when I read this, well, of course, first, as soon as I began reading it, I just enjoyed the writing so much. It just drew me in. But then when I got to the part about the 4 I wills, tell our audience, what are the 4 I wills associated with Passover?
Okay, so the 4 I wills, when God met with Moses and he informed him that he was going to take the children of Israel out of their bondage, out of Egypt, he made a series of promises. And 4 of those promises, God declares, I will take, I will deliver, I will. And the 4th one is this verb in Hebrew. He says in English it's I will take, but in Hebrew it's a verb lakach. He's going to take the children of Israel to himself. And in the sense that it's used, this verb to take is denoting a bridal relationship. It's knowing the children of Israel in a very deep, very intimate sense. And that adds a whole new understanding to what God was desiring to do in that Exodus.
So when I read her 4 I wills, and I had read the story, and maybe I've been through Passover, a Seder a few times, and but that didn't stick. When I read that story, I saw, this is the pattern of the 4. Why 4?
Yeah.
Remember, it was the biggest question of the Blood Moons. Why 4? And where was it in Scripture? Well, we had said that the Exodus should be the model of the Blood Moons. We had said that the book of Exodus would be that model because the feasts were the model for the Blood Moons.
Yes.
Not scriptures about lunar eclipses and the moon being darkened, but scriptures about the feast themselves. And I got to this part about the 4 I wills, and that's the meaning. Each of the 4 blood moons is a progression associated with God's covenant
exactly.
to bring the people out of bondage and home to the promised land. And that was the message of the blood moon. So it was like,
Wow.
well, the book was already written by then, otherwise it would have been in it.
That's really beautiful, and it's true that the promises become stronger and stronger, and there's actually more than 4 promises, but for some reason, perhaps the reason you're suggesting, the rabbis focused on those 4,
Yes.
and that gave rise to the practice of drinking 4 cups of wine at the Passover.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Could you read a paragraph or 2 out of that chapter?
I would love to. There is a paragraph I'd like to read, but before I do, I'll just mention that I go on in that chapter and I explain that how the children of Israel, and we all know the story, how they really they failed to keep the covenant that they made at Sinai. But God was always so merciful and gracious and always wooing them back into that covenant relationship. And so when we come to the book of Jeremiah, we see that at this time, it was a time of great national disaster and exile. But we see that God sovereignly again comes to his people and he makes them these wonderful promises. And again, he declares this is something he is going to do. I will. And this is the promise he makes, that he's going to put within them a new heart, a heart of flesh, and he's going to write his laws on their hearts. So with that understanding,
Yes.
I would like to read this particular passage. This is one of the great passages of the Hebrew Scriptures, the only place where the term New Covenant appears, unfolding a spiritual future which would impact all peoples and nations. This new covenant would be permanent and final, dependent on God's faithfulness alone, and not upon the erring and fragile recipients of his promises. Inaugurated by a great act of forgiveness, in which the overflowing grace in the heart of God would appear, it would have power to melt the most resistant heart and call forth an answering love to the God who does not deal with his creatures on terms of strict legal precision, but who pardons at his own cost. When Jesus took the cup at the Passover supper and spoke the words over it, which instituted the new covenant, he was directing the thoughts of his disciples to the words of Jeremiah as the prophecy which above all others he had come to fulfill. It was an apocalyptic moment in the quiet hush of the upper room, the point in time for which all Israel had watched and waited for so long. As the immortal words fell from his lips, it became disclosed that all the promises of the covenant were to be sealed through the breaking of his body and the shedding of his blood. After this, and as the time of Jesus' passion drew very near, it seemed that a veil was drawn aside, granting a glimpse, as at no other time, of his innermost heart and the intense desire for his own, which had prompted his entire mission. In this penultimate moment, the flame of love in his heart seemed to burn with a new ardor, finding expression in the high priestly prayer for his disciples, which he uttered at the close of the meal.
Thank you for sharing that. I love in that particular story the way you balance the new covenant, which has the 7 I wills, and the Passover, which has the 4. It's just, it's a beautiful, both numbers are rich in meaning and purpose. That alone would have been worth reading it. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, we're going to come back and talk about another of the gems that come out of the feast. We're going to do that in another session. So until then, we're going to say shalom.
Shalom v'litraot.